My mother-in-law called my 12-year-old the idiot child for 3 years. The 8-minute compilation I played ended everything. My mother-in-law, Ruth, had always treated my daughter Jenny differently from her biological grandchildren. Jenny was 12 when I married her son Colin, and Ruth made it clear from day one that Jenny wasn't real family. She'd buy expensive gifts for Colin's sister's kids and get Jenny dollar store junk. When Jenny would thank her politely, Ruth would say, "Well, you should be grateful for anything. You're lucky Colin even lets you live in his house." It wasn't Colin's house. I'd bought it before we met, but Ruth kept telling everyone that Colin had rescued me and my baggage from poverty. The idiot incident happened at Ruth's 70th birthday party. Jenny had spent weeks making a scrapbook filled with family photos and handwritten notes about favorite memories. When Jenny gave it to her, Ruth flipped through it in front of everyone and said, "This is what you got me? A bunch of old pictures glued to paper?" Then she held up the gift from her other grandchild, a store-bought jewelry box, and said, "Now this is a real present, from a real grandchild with a functioning brain." Jenny tried to explain that she'd made it herself because she thought it would mean more. Ruth laughed and said, "Only an idiot would think trash means more than something with actual value." But I guess that's what happens when you come from broken homes. The stupidity gets passed down. She actually used the word idiot 3 more times that night, always directed at Jenny. The idiot child forgot to push in her chair. Someone should teach the idiot proper table manners. Maybe the idiot should eat in the kitchen with the little kids where she belongs. Colin just sat there. When I confronted him later, he said his mother was from a different generation and didn't mean anything by it. "She's just not used to stepkids," he said. "Give her time to adjust." It had been 3 years. Ruth's cruelty escalated after that. She'd accidentally forget to set a place for Jenny at family dinners. She'd plan grandkid outings when Jenny had school events so she couldn't come. She started a college fund for her real grandchildren and made sure Jenny knew she wasn't included. "College would be wasted on someone with your limited capacity," she told Jenny. "Trade school might be more your speed. Or maybe just marry rich like your mother did." She said this at Thanksgiving with 20 people listening. Colin said I was being too sensitive. Then I found out something interesting. Colin's ex-wife, Lindsay, reached out to me. She'd heard through mutual friends how Ruth was treating Jenny. "She did the same thing to my nephew when Colin and I were fostering him," Lindsay said. "Called him stupid, worthless, not a real family. Colin never stood up to her. It's why I left." Lindsay had documented everything back then. She still had emails where Ruth admitted she was trying to drive the foster child away because he wasn't blood. She had recordings of Ruth screaming that Lindsay was infertile trash and should be grateful Colin hadn't dumped her for a real woman who could give him real children. She even had a letter Ruth wrote to Colin saying Lindsay's nephew was probably brain damaged and they should send him back before he infected their future real children with his stupidity. Lindsay gave me everything, but I wasn't done. I started reaching out to other people in Ruth's life. Her younger sister, Janet, confessed that Ruth had tormented her throughout childhood, calling her the idiot sister and telling everyone Janet was adopted because their parents were embarrassed by her. She wasn't adopted. Ruth's former best friend, Amy, told me Ruth had ended their 40-year friendship when Amy's daughter married a man with kids from a previous relationship. Ruth had called the stepchildren parasites and said Amy was enabling the destruction of traditional families. I compiled everything into a presentation. Every email, every recording, every witness statement. Then I waited for the perfect moment. It came at the Christmas party. Ruth was there playing the perfect grandmother, telling Colin's boss how wonderful it was to have such a beautiful family. That's when I asked if I could share a holiday video. I connected my phone to the venue's AV system and played Ruth's greatest hits. Her voice filled the room, calling Jenny an idiot, calling stepchildren parasites, bragging about breaking children, saying Colin should be grateful she raised him to know the difference between real family and fake trash. The compilation was 8 minutes long. The room was dead silent except for Ruth's recorded voice explaining how she was protecting her real grandchildren from contamination by worthless step-siblings. Colin's boss looked horrified. Colin tried to claim the recordings were fake, but then Lindsay walked in. She carried a thick manila folder and walked straight to the front of the room where the screen still showed the frozen final frame of Ruth's face from one of the recordings. Colin stood up and started saying something about doctored audio files, but Lindsay cut him off by holding up her phone and announcing she had the original recordings with full metadata, showing dates, times, and device information that proved every single clip was authentic and unaltered. She said she'd kept everything from when Colin and she were trying to foster her nephew, and Ruth had systematically tried to drive the child away, and she was prepared to testify under oath about the pattern of abuse. Ruth's face went from red to white in seconds. I watched her mouth open and close like she was trying to find words, but nothing came out. Lorelei Carver stood up from her table near the back and walked toward Ruth with her arms crossed. She asked Ruth directly if that was her voice on those recordings, and the room went so quiet, I could hear the heating system clicking. Ruth tried to laugh and said everything was taken out of context, that I'd twisted her words to make her look bad, but her voice cracked halfway through. That's when Janet stood up from the back corner where she'd been sitting quietly through the whole presentation. She said Ruth needed to tell everyone about what she did to her little sister, about how she called Janet the idiot sister their entire childhood, and told everyone Janet was adopted because their parents were ashamed of her stupidity. Janet's voice got louder as she talked, and she said Ruth had been tormenting people for 60 years, and it was time everyone knew the truth. Stuart, who'd been sitting next to Ruth the whole time, suddenly pushed his chair back and stood up. His hands were shaking and his voice cracked when he started talking. He said he'd watched Ruth torment people throughout their entire 40-year marriage, and he was ashamed he never stopped it, that he'd told himself it wasn't his place to interfere, or that Ruth didn't really mean the cruel things she said. He said watching that video made him realize he'd been enabling abuse for decades, and he couldn't live with himself anymore. Aubrey started crying at her table and said she didn't know it was this bad, that she thought her mother just had old-fashioned views about family and stepchildren. Nolan put his arm around her shoulders and stared at Ruth with pure disgust on his face. Ruth looked around the room at all the faces staring at her and seemed to realize she was losing control of the situation. She pointed at me and said, I'd manipulated everyone, that I was a gold digger who'd trapped her son and brought my damaged child into their family, and she was only trying to protect her real grandchildren from contamination. Her voice got higher and shakier as she talked. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the speaker system again. I told everyone there was one more recording they needed to hear, one that Colin didn't know I had. I pressed play, and Ruth's voice filled the room again, this time talking to Colin about how Jenny was probably brain damaged from her broken home, and they needed to find a way to get rid of both of us before we contaminated the family permanently. The recording was from 2 months ago, long after Colin had promised me his mother was getting better and learning to accept Jenny. I watched Colin's face drain of all color as his mother's voice described me as a parasite, and Jenny as defective genetic material that would ruin the family bloodline if we stayed. He never told me about that conversation. He'd sat across from me at dinner that night and smiled and talked about his day like everything was normal, while his mother's words about getting rid of us sat in his head. I looked directly at him and asked if he was ever going to tell me his mother called our daughter brain damaged and talked about getting rid of us. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out and he couldn't meet my eyes. The room stayed completely silent except for someone near the back crying quietly. Then I heard footsteps from the hallway entrance and turned to see Jenny walking in with tears running down her face. Lindsay must have brought her to the party and they'd been listening from the hall. Jenny walked right up to Colin and asked him why he never protected her. Her voice was steady even though she was crying, and she asked him why he let his mother call her an idiot for 3 years, why he sat there at every family dinner while Ruth made her feel worthless. She said she'd tried so hard to make Ruth like her, that she'd made that scrapbook and learned Ruth's favorite recipes and always said thank you even for the dollar store gifts. But nothing was ever good enough because Colin never stood up for her. The entire party watched this 12-year-old girl confront her stepfather, and Colin had absolutely nothing to say that wouldn't make him look even worse than he already did. He tried to say he was sorry, but Jenny cut him off and said sorry didn't fix 3 years of abandonment. I walked over and put my arm around Jenny and told Colin we were leaving. I said he needed to decide whether he was married to me or to his mother because he couldn't have both anymore, and I was done waiting for him to grow a spine. Lindsay said she'd drive us home and started walking toward the door with us. Behind us, Ruth started screaming that I'd destroyed her family and turned everyone against her, that she'd done nothing wrong and we were all going to regret this. Her voice followed us down the hallway even after we went through the doors. At home that night, Jenny sat on the couch and asked me if she really was stupid, like Ruth said. I pulled up the full compilation on my laptop, including the parts I hadn't played at the party. The recordings where Ruth explicitly talked about her strategy of targeting people's weak points to break them down. I showed Jenny the email where Ruth told Colin's aunt that she'd successfully driven away Lindsay's foster nephew by making him feel worthless, and how she planned to use the same tactics on any future stepchildren. Jenny watched the whole thing with tears streaming down her face, and when it was done, I explained that Ruth was a bully who'd been doing this for decades, that she picked people she decided didn't belong, and systematically tried to destroy their confidence. I told Jenny that none of it was ever about her actual worth or intelligence, that Ruth would have treated any stepchild the same way because she sees them as threats to her perfect family image. Jenny asked why Colin let it happen, and I said I didn't know, that sometimes people choose the easy path of keeping peace over the hard path of doing what's right. Lindsay stayed with us that night and sat down next to Jenny on the couch. She started telling Jenny about her own marriage to Colin, and how Ruth had spent years convincing her she was worthless because she couldn't have biological children. She said Ruth told her repeatedly that she was failing as a woman, and that Colin deserved someone who could give him real children instead of being stuck with her defective body. Lindsay said Ruth's greatest skill was finding exactly what someone was most insecure about, and then hammering on that weakness until they believed all the cruel things she said. She told Jenny that it took years of therapy for her to stop hearing Ruth's voice in her head telling her she was worthless, and that recognizing Ruth's pattern was the first step to not letting those words define her. My phone started ringing at midnight and Colin's name flashed on the screen. I answered, and he immediately started begging to come home, saying we needed to talk and he could fix this. I told him he made his choice every single time he sat silent while his mother tortured Jenny, that he had 3 years of opportunities to protect a child, and he chose his own comfort instead. He said he was trying to keep the peace and didn't want to cause family drama, that his mother had always been difficult, and he'd learned it was easier to just let her say what she wanted. I said protecting a child should matter more than avoiding uncomfortable conversations, and that Jenny deserved better than a stepfather who valued peace over her well-being. He started crying and said he loved Jenny and didn't realize how bad things had gotten. I told him he didn't want to realize it because then he'd have to do something about it, and doing something would mean standing up to his mother, which he'd never been willing to do. I said he could call back when he was ready to actually choose his family over his mother's feelings, and then I hung up. The next morning, I woke up to Jenny already dressed and sitting on the couch with Lindsay, who'd stayed over. The doorbell rang at 9, and I opened it to find Aubrey standing there with her 2 kids. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she kept twisting her hands together. She asked if she could come in, and I stepped aside to let them through. Her son was 10, and her daughter was 8, and they both looked uncomfortable standing in my living room. Aubrey sat down and told Jenny she was sorry. She said she noticed Ruth treated Jenny differently, but convinced herself it wasn't that bad. She said hearing the recordings where Ruth planned to drive Jenny away made her sick. She kept saying she should have spoken up, and she failed Jenny by staying silent. Her voice cracked when she said she was horrified by what Ruth had done, and she understood now why I played that video. Jenny just nodded and didn't say much. Aubrey's son looked at Jenny and asked if Grandma Ruth really said all those mean things. Jenny said yes quietly. The boy said that's why Jenny always looked sad at family stuff. He said he felt bad he never tried to make her feel better. Jenny's eyes filled with tears, but she thanked him for saying that. Aubrey's daughter asked why Grandma was so mean, and I explained that some people hurt others on purpose, and it says something about them, not about the people they hurt. Aubrey stayed for coffee and told me Colin moved back in with his parents last night. She said their dad Stuart was upset, and Ruth was acting like she was the victim. After Aubrey left, my phone rang and Janet's name showed up. She asked if she could meet with Jenny and me because she wanted Jenny to understand Ruth's cruelty wasn't new or personal. I agreed, and we set up a time to meet at a coffee shop that afternoon. When we got there, Janet was already sitting at a corner table with 3 cups of hot chocolate. She hugged Jenny and told her she was brave for surviving 3 years of Ruth's poison. Then she started sharing stories about growing up as the idiot sister. She said Ruth told everyone Janet was adopted because their parents were embarrassed by her. She said Ruth would introduce her to people as the family disappointment. Janet said she spent decades in therapy trying to undo the damage Ruth caused. She told Jenny that Ruth made her believe she was worthless and stupid until she was almost 40. Jenny asked why Ruth was like that, and Janet said some people need to feel superior by making others feel small. Janet explained that Ruth targets people she sees as threats to her control or her perfect family story. She said Jenny was both because Jenny proved Colin married someone with a past. Janet looked Jenny in the eyes and said the best revenge was refusing to believe Ruth's poison and building a life that proved every cruel word wrong. Jenny asked how she was supposed to do that when Ruth's voice was stuck in her head. Janet said it took time and work, but eventually you learn to recognize the lies and push back against them. She said Jenny was already ahead because she had people fighting for her, which Janet never had. When we got home that evening, Stuart called. His voice sounded tired and sad. He said he needed to apologize for his son's cowardice and his own decades of letting Ruth hurt people. He said watching Jenny confront Colin at the party made him realize how many people he failed by staying silent. He said he was finally ready to set boundaries with Ruth, even though it was 40 years too late. He asked if he could be part of Jenny's life going forward as someone who would actually protect her. I told him Jenny could decide that when she was ready. The next day, Lindsay called and said Amy wanted to meet with me. Amy was Ruth's old friend who ended their friendship over step-family stuff. Lindsay gave me Amy's number and I called her. Amy said she had documentation about Ruth's pattern with blended families. We met at a park and she brought a folder full of letters. She showed me letters where Ruth called Amy's step-grandchildren parasites and genetic dead ends. Amy said Ruth ended their 40-year friendship because Amy's daughter married a man with kids from before. She said Ruth believed Amy was helping destroy traditional families by accepting stepchildren as real family. Amy explained that Ruth truly believed stepfamilies were wrong and that stepchildren contaminated real families. She said Ruth thought she was protecting her bloodline by driving away outsiders. Amy said Ruth's cruelty wasn't random or emotional. It was calculated and purposeful because she genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. That made it worse somehow, knowing Ruth thought torturing Jenny was justified. My phone started ringing constantly over the next few days. Some family members called to say they supported me. Others called to say I was wrong for humiliating Ruth publicly. Colin's aunt left a voicemail saying I should have handled this privately, instead of showing that video in front of Colin's boss and professional contacts. I called her back and asked why Ruth's 3 years of publicly humiliating Jenny at every family gathering were fine, but my 8-minute video wasn't. She hung up on me. I made an appointment with a therapist who worked with kids dealing with emotional abuse and family trauma. Jenny went to her first session and came out looking lighter somehow. The therapist called me in after and said Ruth's behavior was textbook psychological abuse. She said Jenny would need time to rebuild her confidence and sense of worth. She also said if I wanted to save my marriage, Colin and I needed family therapy, but only if Colin fully admitted he failed to protect Jenny. That night, Colin sent me a long email. He said he wanted to fix things, but didn't know how to do that without losing his mother. He asked if I could understand how hard it was being caught between the two people he loved. I read it 3 times and then I wrote back. I said he was never caught between us because I never asked him to choose. I said I only asked him to protect a child from abuse. I told him his failure to do that one basic thing meant he already made his choice years ago. Lindsay called the next morning and said she'd been getting messages all night from Colin's extended family. His cousin reached out first, then an aunt from his father's side, then 2 more cousins I'd only met once at the wedding. They all said the same thing, that they'd watched Ruth treat people badly for years, but nobody felt like they could say anything, because she was the family matriarch, and challenging her meant getting cut off from everyone. Lindsay was putting together a document with all their statements, dates they remembered, specific incidents, patterns they'd noticed. She said if Ruth tried to claim I made everything up or edited the recordings to sound worse, we'd have a dozen people ready to confirm the pattern went back decades. I thanked her and asked why she was helping me this much when she could have just stayed out of it. She said watching that video made her relive every horrible thing Ruth said to her, and if helping me meant one less person had to live through that kind of torture, it was worth whatever awkwardness it caused with Colin's family. The next call came from Janet 2 days later. She sounded worried and said Ruth was already working on damage control. Ruth was telling people I had mental health issues and that I'd edited the recordings to make her sound cruel when she was really just being a concerned grandmother trying to set boundaries. Janet said Ruth was claiming the whole thing was revenge because she wouldn't give me money or let me control the family. I felt my stomach drop because I knew some people would believe that version, especially the ones who wanted to avoid confronting what Ruth really was. Janet said she wanted to make a public statement about Ruth's lifelong pattern of abuse, that she'd post it on social media where everyone could see it, and there'd be no way for Ruth to spin it as just one person's vendetta. I told her I couldn't ask her to do that, but Janet cut me off and said she'd spent 60 years letting Ruth get away with calling her stupid and worthless, and she was done protecting her sister's reputation at the cost of her own dignity. 3 days later, Janet posted a detailed account of growing up with Ruth, complete with specific incidents and the lasting damage they caused. The post got shared hundreds of times in our community. 2 weeks after the Christmas party, I walked into a lawyer's office and filed for legal separation. The lawyer asked if I wanted to pursue full divorce, and I said not yet, that I needed to focus on getting Jenny stable before making permanent decisions about the marriage. Colin called me crying after he got served with the papers, saying he couldn't believe I was really doing this over something his mother said. I reminded him it wasn't over something Ruth said. It was over 3 years of him watching Ruth torture Jenny and doing nothing. He said he was trying to fix it now, and didn't that count for something? I told him he had 3 years to fix it and only cared now because there were consequences for his inaction. Jenny's teacher called that same week and said she'd noticed a change in Jenny over the past few days. She said Jenny seemed lighter somehow, more engaged in class discussions, quicker to smile. The teacher asked if something positive had happened at home because whatever it was making a real difference in Jenny's participation and confidence. I explained that we'd removed a toxic family member from Jenny's life, and Jenny was starting to feel safe again. The teacher was quiet for a moment and then said she'd always noticed Jenny seemed anxious and withdrawn after family weekends, that she'd wondered if something was wrong, but wasn't sure if it was her place to ask. She said she was glad someone was finally protecting Jenny, and if there was anything the school could do to support her, they would. Lorelai sent me a private email the next day. She said she'd been thinking about the Christmas party constantly and wanted me to know that what she witnessed wouldn't affect Colin's job, but she completely understood if I needed distance from him. She wrote that she has stepchildren herself from her husband's first marriage, and Ruth's words made her physically sick. She said she'd seen too many blended families torn apart by people like Ruth, who refused to accept that love isn't limited by biology. And she was glad someone finally stood up to that kind of cruelty in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. The school called me 3 days later in a panic. Ruth had shown up during lunch trying to check Jenny out of class, claiming there was a family emergency. The office staff asked Jenny if she wanted to go with her grandmother, and Jenny said no, that Ruth wasn't allowed to take her anywhere. Ruth started yelling that I was poisoning Jenny against her own family and that she had grandparent rights. I drove to the school immediately with copies of documentation showing Ruth's pattern of psychological abuse toward Jenny. The principal read through the papers where Ruth called Jenny an idiot and said she understood why I needed to restrict Ruth's access. They updated Jenny's file to show Ruth wasn't authorized for pickup or contact and increased security protocols to make sure she couldn't get to Jenny on campus. Stuart called Colin that same evening and said he was filing for divorce from Ruth. Colin called me in shock, saying his dad was leaving his mom after 40 years of marriage and he couldn't understand why. I could hear Stuart in the background asking for the phone. Stuart told me directly that watching the Christmas party made him realize he'd been complicit in Ruth's cruelty for decades, and he couldn't live with that anymore. He said some lines can't be uncrossed, and Ruth crossed them years ago when she started targeting children. Colin kept trying to interrupt, saying his parents could work it out if they just went to counseling. But Stuart said there was nothing to work out, because he finally saw his wife for who she really was, and he was ashamed it took him this long. Aubrey stopped bringing her kids to Ruth's house and told Ruth she wouldn't expose her children to someone who torments other children for not being blood-related. Ruth apparently accused Aubrey of betraying her own mother and choosing an outsider's child over family. Aubrey told Colin later that she'd responded by saying she was protecting her children from learning that cruelty is acceptable, and that if Ruth couldn't understand the difference between family loyalty and enabling abuse, then Ruth had failed as both a mother and a grandmother. Jenny came to me one night while I was doing dishes and asked if she could change her last name to match mine instead of keeping Colin's surname. She said she didn't want to share a name with someone who didn't protect her when she needed him. I dried my hands and sat down with her at the kitchen table. I told her we could discuss it, but she should take time to process everything before making permanent decisions like that. I said Colin might still step up if we gave him the chance, that people sometimes need to hit rock bottom before they change. Jenny said she'd think about it, but she wasn't making any promises about forgiving him. Colin finally agreed to family therapy after I told him it was his last chance to save any relationship with Jenny. The therapist's office was small and neutral, with comfortable chairs and tissues on every surface. The therapist asked Colin to explain why he never intervened when Ruth called Jenny an idiot. Colin started talking about his mother being from a different generation and not understanding modern blended families, about not wanting to cause conflict during family gatherings. The therapist held up her hand and stopped him. She said she didn't ask about his mother's motivations or his desire to avoid conflict. She asked him to answer the actual question, which was why Jenny's well-being mattered less than his comfort. Colin sat there looking at his hands and couldn't come up with an answer that didn't make him sound exactly like what he was, someone who chose the easy path over protecting a child who depended on him. The therapist let the silence stretch until Colin finally whispered that he didn't have a good answer. She scheduled him for twice-weekly sessions after that, saying he needed intensive work to unpack why he'd learned to value peace over protection. Over the next month, I watched Colin slowly start to crack open the reality of what he'd done. He came to one session and admitted he'd known Ruth was cruel, but told himself it wasn't his problem to fix because standing up to her meant dealing with her rage and guilt trips. The therapist asked him what message that sent to Jenny, and Colin broke down crying. He said Jenny must have thought she deserved the abuse because the one person who should have protected her just sat there and let it happen. The therapist told him acknowledgement was important, but Jenny needed to see changed behavior over years, not just words and tears in a therapy office. Colin asked what changed behavior looked like, and the therapist said it meant choosing Jenny's well-being over his own comfort every single time, even when it was hard. Meanwhile, Ruth started calling family members with her version of events. She told everyone I was keeping Jenny away from her grandmother, and had manipulated the whole family into believing lies about her. She claimed the recordings were edited and taken out of context, that I'd poisoned everyone against her because I was jealous of her close relationship with Colin. But then Janet posted on Facebook about growing up as Ruth's target, sharing specific stories about being called the idiot sister and told she was adopted. Amy commented on Janet's post with her own story about Ruth ending their 40-year friendship over stepchildren. Both posts got shared around our community, and suddenly dozens of people were commenting with their own Ruth stories. Someone from her church said Ruth had called a widow's new husband a gold digger in front of the whole congregation. A former neighbor said Ruth had reported her stepson to CPS with false claims because she didn't like seeing him in the neighborhood. The posts went semi-viral locally, and Ruth's reputation took a serious hit. People started avoiding her at the grocery store. Her book club uninvited her. Even her hairdresser suddenly had no available appointments. Colin called me 2 weeks after moving back in with his parents and said he couldn't stay there anymore. He told me he'd rented a small apartment across town because he needed space from Ruth to figure out who he was without her constant influence. He asked if he could see Jenny in supervised visits while he worked on himself in individual therapy. I said I'd agree as long as Jenny was comfortable with it, and Jenny said she'd try but wasn't making any promises. The first supervised visit happened at a coffee shop with me sitting at the next table. Colin sat across from Jenny looking like he might throw up. He told her directly that nothing his mother said was true, and he should have said that 3 years ago. Jenny asked him why he didn't, and Colin took a long breath before answering. He said he was a coward who cared more about avoiding conflict than protecting her, and he was ashamed of that. He said he'd spent his whole life learning to keep Ruth happy, and somewhere along the way he forgot that protecting children were more important than keeping peace. Jenny didn't say much, just nodded and drank her hot chocolate. When the visit ended, she told me it was okay, but she wasn't ready to forgive him yet. 2 days later, Ruth showed up at my house. I saw her car pull into the driveway and immediately grabbed my phone to start recording. She pounded on the door screaming that I'd turned everyone against her with lies and manipulation. I opened the door with my phone clearly visible and calmly asked her to leave my property. Ruth called me a gold digger and said Jenny was a burden I'd tricked Colin into accepting. She said I'd destroyed her family and she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. I told her I was recording everything and asked her one more time to leave. She lunged toward the door, trying to push past me, so I called the police while she screamed on my front porch. The police arrived and removed her from my property, documenting everything in their report. I took that police report straight to a lawyer the next morning. The documentation of Ruth's behavior, combined with the recordings from the Christmas party and witness statements from Janet and Amy, was enough to get a restraining order protecting both Jenny and me from any contact with Ruth. Colin was upset when I told him, saying he never thought it would come to this. But he admitted his mother's behavior at my house proved she hadn't learned anything, and still believed she was justified in how she treated Jenny. 3 months after the Christmas party, Jenny had a breakthrough in therapy. She told her therapist she was starting to believe she wasn't actually stupid, and that Ruth's words were about Ruth's problems, not Jenny's worth. Her therapist called me after the session to say this was major progress, that Jenny was developing healthy ways to deal with the internalized messages Ruth had planted. Jenny was sleeping better, doing better in the school, and starting to trust that adults could actually protect her. Colin's therapy was revealing the roots of his behavior. His therapist told me he'd grown up walking on eggshells around Ruth's moods, learning early that appeasing her was safer than confronting her. That pattern became so automatic that he defaulted to it with Jenny without even thinking about it. He was working on understanding that protecting children required overcoming that conditioning, but his therapist said undoing decades of learned behavior was hard work that would take time. Then Stuart reached out to Jenny. He sent her a letter asking if they could meet, saying he wanted to apologize for not protecting her and for setting a bad example of what men should do when they witness abuse. He asked if he could be part of her life going forward as someone who would actually stand up for her. Jenny read the letter twice before telling me she'd give him a chance. They met for lunch and Stuart cried while apologizing for every time he stayed silent. Jenny told me later that she believed him because he'd actually left Ruth and changed his whole life, not just said sorry. Lindsay started coming over regularly, bringing Jenny books and taking her to movies. Jenny began seeing her as an aunt figure who understood what Ruth's abuse felt like from the inside. Lindsay shared coping strategies that had worked for her, like writing down Ruth's cruel words and then writing the truth next to them. She validated Jenny's feelings in ways that helped Jenny process the trauma, telling her that anger at Colin was justified, and she didn't have to forgive anyone before she was ready. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope showed up in my mailbox with Jenny's name on it and no return address. I opened it because of the restraining order and found 3 pages of Ruth's handwriting blaming Jenny for everything. She wrote that Jenny destroyed her family by being too sensitive and turning everyone against her. She said Jenny should be grateful Ruth tolerated her presence for 3 years, instead of demanding Colin get rid of her from the start. She actually wrote that Jenny was poison, and Colin would have been better off if I'd never brought my damaged child into their perfect family. I took photos of every page with my phone and called my lawyer immediately. The lawyer said this was a clear restraining order violation since Ruth used Colin's cousin to deliver it, and the order prohibited any contact, direct or indirect. We filed the violation report that afternoon, and Ruth got hit with a $1,000 fine, plus the judge extended the restraining order for another year and made it stricter. Any future violations would result in jail time. Ruth tried to claim she didn't know using a relative counted as contact, but the judge told her ignorance of the law wasn't an excuse, and she should have consulted her own lawyer before attempting any communication. Colin showed up at my door the next evening looking exhausted and told me he'd made a decision. He said he needed to completely cut contact with Ruth if he had any chance of repairing things with Jenny. I asked if he was sure because I knew how hard it would be for him. He nodded and said watching Stuart finally leave after 40 years showed him it was possible to break free even when it felt impossible. He said Ruth had already started calling him 20 times a day since the violation hearing, screaming that he needed to control his wife and make me drop the charges. She told him he was weak and pathetic for letting me destroy their family. Colin said he finally heard how she talked to people and realized Jenny had been living with that poison for 3 years while he did nothing. He blocked Ruth's number that night and told Aubrey to inform their mother he wouldn't be taking her calls anymore. 6 months passed and things started feeling different. Jenny came home from the school one Tuesday in April with a report card showing she'd made honor roll for the first time. She was smiling bigger than I'd seen in years and asked if we could celebrate, but she wasn't ready to include Colin yet. I told her absolutely and asked who she wanted to invite. She said Lindsay, Janet, and Stuart, the people who actually stood up for her when it mattered. We went to her favorite restaurant that weekend, and Jenny talked about her classes and her friends without that shadow of anxiety she used to carry everywhere. Stuart brought her flowers and told her he was proud of her. Lindsay gave her a gift card for books. Janet hugged her and said this was just the beginning of Jenny proving Ruth wrong about everything. Jenny glowed the whole night, and I realized this was the first major achievement she'd celebrated without Ruth's voice in her head, telling her she wasn't good enough. Colin texted me a few days later asking if he could send Jenny a card congratulating her on honor roll. I showed Jenny the text and asked what she wanted. She thought about it for a minute, then said she'd accept a card, but she wanted me to tell him something first. I called Colin and Jenny stood next to me while I put him on speaker. She told him she appreciated that he was trying, but 3 years of abandonment couldn't be fixed with 6 months of therapy. She said she wasn't ready to forgive him yet, and he needed to understand that. Colin's voice cracked when he said he understood, and he'd wait as long as it took. After we hung up, I told Jenny she was absolutely right to set that boundary, and she shouldn't feel pressured to forgive anyone before she was ready. The card arrived 2 days later with a simple message about being proud of her hard work, and he'd be here whenever she wanted to talk. Aubrey called me in May to give me an update about Ruth. She said more family members were distancing themselves after Janet and Amy made their public statements on social media. Ruth's friends from church had stopped inviting her to events. Her book club kicked her out after someone shared Amy's post about how Ruth ended their 40-year friendship over stepchildren. Aubrey said Ruth was bitter and angry, calling everyone traitors and insisting she did nothing wrong. Ruth kept telling anyone who'd listen that Jenny was a manipulative child who'd orchestrated everything to steal Colin away from his real family. Aubrey said it was sad watching their mother destroy every relationship she had because she couldn't admit she was cruel to a 12-year-old kid. Even Ruth's own sister wouldn't talk to her anymore. Jenny's therapy sessions started showing real progress around this time. Her therapist called me after one appointment to say Jenny was talking about her future with genuine confidence. Jenny had mentioned wanting to study marine biology in college and maybe work at an aquarium someday. She talked about different universities she'd researched and career paths she found interesting. The therapist said this was significant because Jenny was reclaiming her sense of possibility after 3 years of Ruth telling her she was too stupid for higher education. Jenny wasn't letting Ruth's voice define her limits anymore. She was building dreams without that constant background noise saying she'd fail at everything. I noticed it at home too. Jenny would talk about college visits and scholarship applications without that defeated look she used to get whenever the future came up. Colin's individual therapy was digging into deeper issues about his role in everything. His therapist helped him understand that enabling Ruth's abuse was itself a form of abuse toward Jenny. Colin called me one night and said he'd written Jenny a letter taking full accountability without making excuses. He said he wasn't asking her to read it right away, but he wanted her to have it when she was ready. I gave the letter to Jenny, and she read it in her room. She came out an hour later and told me the letter was good, and Colin finally seemed to get what he'd done wrong. But she said she needed more time before she was ready to respond. I told her that was completely fair, and there was no rush. Something shifted in me around July, and I realized I was ready to start dating again. It surprised me because I'd been so focused on Jenny and the divorce proceedings that I hadn't thought about my own future. My therapist said it was healthy to remember I deserved partnership with someone who would prioritize protecting my child. I joined a dating app and started going on casual coffee dates. Colin heard about it through Aubrey and called me sounding hurt. I told him I understood it was hard for him, but he destroyed our marriage by failing Jenny when it mattered most. He was quiet for a long time, then said he knew I was right, and he hoped I'd find someone who'd be the partner he should have been. I appreciated that he didn't try to guilt me or ask me to wait for him. Jenny came to me in August with an unexpected request. She asked if she could testify in Stuart's divorce proceedings about what she'd witnessed of Ruth's treatment of him over the years. I was surprised, but I called Stuart to ask if that would help his case. Stuart's lawyer said it would be powerful testimony about Ruth's pattern of emotional abuse toward multiple people. The lawyer explained that Jenny could describe specific incidents where Ruth belittled Stuart in front of family or made decisions without consulting him. Jenny told me she wanted to help Stuart the way he'd been helping her since the Christmas party. She said Stuart had shown her what it looked like when someone actually changed their behavior instead of just apologizing. I told her I was proud of her for wanting to stand up for someone else. The divorce hearing happened on a Wednesday morning in September. Jenny wore a nice dress and looked nervous but determined. The judge asked her to describe what she'd observed of Ruth and Stuart's relationship. Jenny's voice was clear and steady as she talked about watching Ruth mock Stuart's opinions at family dinners and make major financial decisions without telling him. She described how Ruth would cut Stuart off mid-sentence and tell everyone he didn't understand anything. Jenny mentioned the time Ruth bought a new car without consulting Stuart, then berated him in front of the whole family for questioning the expense. She talked about how Ruth controlled what Stuart wore and who he spent time with. The judge listened carefully and asked Jenny a few follow-up questions. Jenny answered each one honestly and specifically. When she finished, the judge thanked her for her courage in speaking up. Stuart's lawyer told me later that Jenny's testimony strengthened their case significantly because it showed Ruth's abuse wasn't limited to stepchildren, but extended to her own husband for decades. The judge's final ruling came 3 weeks later, and Ruth lost almost everything in the settlement. Stuart got the house. Most of their savings and his retirement accounts stayed entirely his own. Ruth walked away with barely enough to rent a small apartment and cover basic expenses. Stuart called me the day after the settlement finalized and asked if he could stop by with something for Jenny. He arrived that evening carrying an envelope and looking nervous. He handed it to Jenny and told her to open it. Inside was paperwork for a college fund he'd set up in her name using part of his settlement money. The account already had $50,000 in it. There was also a handwritten note on plain paper. Jenny read it out loud, her voice getting shaky. Stuart had written that he was sorry it took him 40 years to do the right thing, and that he hoped this could help give her the future Ruth tried to take away. Jenny started crying and hugged Stuart, telling him she forgave him because he actually changed his behavior instead of just saying sorry. Stuart cried too and told Jenny she deserved so much better than what his family put her through. Colin reached out in early November, exactly 1 year after he started therapy. He asked if we could try marriage counseling to see if there was any path forward for us. I told him I was willing to try, but Jenny's well-being was the priority, and if she wasn't comfortable with reconciliation, it wouldn't happen no matter what he and I worked through. He said he understood, and that Jenny's comfort mattered more than his feelings. We started marriage counseling the following week. The therapist was a woman in her 50s who specialized in family trauma. She asked Colin to explain what he understood about how his enabling harmed Jenny. Colin didn't make excuses this time. He said he prioritized his own comfort over Jenny's safety, because confronting his mother scared him more than watching Jenny suffer. He admitted that his silence told Jenny she didn't matter as much as keeping peace with Ruth. He outlined specific ways he planned to prioritize Jenny's well-being going forward, including cutting off anyone who treated her badly, and believing Jenny immediately if she said someone made her uncomfortable. The therapist listened carefully and said she was cautiously optimistic, but emphasized that rebuilding trust would take years and required consistent action, not just words. She told Colin that Jenny would be watching his behavior closely, and one failure could undo all his progress. Jenny had been doing supervised visits with Colin for months by that point. In late December, she told me she was ready to try unsupervised visits because she'd seen a year of changed behavior and genuine remorse from him. I asked if she was sure, and she said yes, but she wanted to talk to Colin first. They met at a coffee shop, and Jenny told him she was willing to try rebuilding their relationship, but she'd never forget that he failed her when she needed him. She said he needed to prove every day that he was different now, and one mistake would end everything. Colin agreed to her terms without arguing. Their first unsupervised visit was lunch at a restaurant Jenny picked. Colin told me later that Jenny spent most of the meal testing him by bringing up memories of Ruth's cruelty and watching how he responded. He passed her tests by acknowledging each incident and taking responsibility for not protecting her. Ruth made one final attempt to contact Jenny in January through a letter that came to our house. The envelope had Ruth's return address, and Jenny brought it to her therapist before opening it. They read it together in session. Ruth claimed she was dying from cancer and wanted to make amends before it was too late. The therapist helped Jenny see the manipulation tactics Ruth was using, including the fake medical crisis and the pressure to respond quickly. Jenny decided to write back but set firm boundaries. Her response said Ruth could make amends by getting therapy and acknowledging the specific harm she caused, but Jenny wouldn't have contact with her regardless of whether Ruth was actually sick. Jenny mailed the letter and told me she felt relieved to have responded on her own terms instead of ignoring it or giving Ruth what she wanted. Lindsay called me in February with surprising news. She'd gotten engaged to someone she met at a support group for people dealing with toxic family members. Her fiancé had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and Lindsay said going through the Ruth situation helped her recognize red flags in partners who might enable that kind of treatment. She told me her fiancé immediately shut down his own mother when she made a comment about his kids being from a broken home. Lindsay was grateful that exposing Ruth's abuse helped her protect her future stepchildren from ever experiencing something similar. She invited Jenny and me to the engagement party, and Jenny was excited to celebrate with her. Janet published an essay in March about growing up with an abusive sibling and the long-term effects of childhood emotional abuse. The essay appeared in a major online magazine and got thousands of shares. Janet wrote about how Ruth tormented her throughout childhood and how she spent decades believing she was actually stupid, like Ruth said. She shared it with Jenny as an example of how survivors can reclaim their narratives and help others. Jenny read the whole essay twice and told Janet she might want to write her own story someday when she was ready. Janet said she'd help Jenny however she needed when that time came. 2 years after the Christmas party, Jenny was thriving in high school. She made honor roll every semester and had a solid group of friends who knew nothing about Ruth. Jenny told me one afternoon that she sometimes still heard Ruth's voice calling her an idiot, but now she could recognize it as a lie and push back against it. Her therapist said that showed remarkable resilience and meant Jenny had developed healthy coping strategies for dealing with the internalized messages. Jenny was even thinking about colleges and talking about majoring in psychology to help other kids who went through family trauma. Colin and I slowly rebuilt our marriage with Jenny's cautious blessing. It was a fundamentally different relationship now with clear boundaries about family loyalty and child protection. Colin proved through consistent action that he'd broken free from Ruth's influence and would never prioritize keeping peace over protecting Jenny again. He checked in with Jenny regularly about how she felt and immediately addressed any concerns she raised. We went to marriage counseling every week, and Colin did individual therapy twice a month. The therapist said our progress was better than she expected, but warned us that backsliding was always possible, and we needed to stay alert. Stuart became a positive grandfather figure to Jenny, taking her to museums and supporting her interests in ways Ruth never did. They went to art galleries and science exhibits, and Stuart actually listened when Jenny explained things to him. He told Jenny one day at the Natural History Museum that watching her stand up to Colin at the Christmas party inspired him to finally leave Ruth. He said sometimes children have to teach adults about courage, and Jenny taught him that protecting people matters more than avoiding conflict. Jenny said she was proud of him for leaving Ruth even though it was hard, and Stuart said he was proud of her for surviving Ruth's cruelty and coming out stronger. Aubrey started bringing her kids over for weekend visits, and the difference was immediate. Her son, who was 10 now, told Jenny he was glad she was their cousin, and he felt bad about how Ruth treated her. Her daughter added that they always knew something was wrong at family gatherings, but didn't understand what was happening. Jenny thanked them and said having cousins who actually treated her like family helped heal some of the damage Ruth created. We did board game nights and backyard barbecues, and I watched Jenny laugh with kids who finally saw her as an equal instead of an outsider. Aubrey told me privately that her children asked why they never stood up for Jenny before, and she had to explain that sometimes adults fail to protect kids even when they know something is wrong. Meanwhile, Ruth remained isolated in her anger. She tried calling Stuart with guilt trips about abandoning his wife of 40 years. She sent letters to Aubrey claiming we had all turned against her based on lies. She even attempted to reach Colin through his work email saying she was his mother and deserved respect. But everyone had learned to recognize her tactics. Stuart deleted her voicemails without listening. Aubrey blocked her number. Colin told me he grieved the mother he wished he had, but accepted the reality of who she actually was. He said he was at peace with the distance because protecting Jenny mattered more than maintaining a relationship with someone who refused to change. One afternoon, Jenny brought up her last name while we were making dinner. She said she'd been thinking about changing it to mine but decided to keep Colin's surname after all. She explained it represented her whole family, including the people who eventually stood up for her, not just the ones who failed her initially. She said Ruth didn't get to take away her connection to Stuart, Aubrey, and the family members who chose her side. I told her I was proud of her for making that choice, and she smiled. On Jenny's 16th birthday, we threw a party with everyone who mattered. Lindsay brought her fiancé and his kids. Janet came with her partner. Stuart arrived early to help set up. Aubrey's whole family showed up with homemade decorations. Colin was there too, nervous but present. After we sang and cut the cake, Jenny stood up to give a toast. She thanked everyone who helped her understand that Ruth's cruelty was never about her worth. She said she was proud of who she was becoming, and grateful for the family she built from people who actually loved and protected her. Her voice was steady and clear. I watched my daughter shine with confidence that Ruth tried so hard to destroy but couldn't. Jenny had survived and she had won.